I'm not much of a river person, really. I suppose most of my time interacting with rivers is either standing in them or next to them, trying to catch things that swim and are much cleverer than I am. But today, I'm going to talk about some work we did to have a bit of a look at the impacts that feral horses have on the treeless drainage lines up at the top of the big hills in southeastern Australia, the Australian Alps. Now, this work was a collaborative project between New South Wales Parks and Wildlife Service, Parks Victoria, and it was supported by this cooperative management program called the Australian Alps Cooperative Management Program, so an interaction between Alps Management Agency. And this story is a bit sad because it's a story of degradation, but happily it's also a story of hope. So let's start by having a little bit of a chat about feral horses. They've been in the Australian Alps for a long time, at least 130 years, and they're very much part of the folklore of that landscape, and very much important to the way a lot of people identify themselves and identify with the Australian Alps. They're pretty widespread. They occur in much of the Alps. So this map I'm showing shows the Australian Alps along here from ACT down through into eastern Victoria. And this blob here, and this blob here, and this blob here, and this blob here, and this blob here without a line around it are all the big patches where feral horses occur across the Alps. This blob and this blob and this blob, just remember them because they're relevant to the next slide. Because what's going on is horses in the Alps are really increasing in abundance. So this little simple graph shows estimates of the size of the horse population in those three blobs I was just pointing at on the map in 2014 and 5 years later in 2019, based on aerial surveys that we did collaboratively in Victoria and New South Wales and the ACT. And that's a bit scary because feral horses do damage to alpine ecosystems, the streams, the wetlands, the herblands, the heathlands, all those fragile systems that occur up there in the snow country at the top of the mountains. And these impacts have been a concern, well, at least in the scientific literature, for at least 70 years. And managing an issue like feral horses is a complex thing. This silly little equation I put over here to illustrate the point, and it's probably something everyone understands, is that with a matter like feral horse management and feral horse impacts, decision making is a complex thing, and certainly it's influenced by science, but it's also influenced by economics, it's influenced by social factors, and it's influenced by political factors. But the good news is that science certainly is one of the influencing factors, and it's important for a number of reasons. It's important because decision makers want to know that their decisions are based on sound information. It's also important for giving the public confidence in what's going on and giving management agencies license to act and to deal with issues. It's important for informing how to manage, and it's important for improving management into the future. So, our study. Why did we want to go and have a look at the impacts of feral horses in treeless drainage lines? Well, at the time when we did our work, there was this really strong need for a better understanding of what feral horse impacts look like across the Alps, how widespread they were, and how severe they were. Certainly, these impacts were all out there, widely reported, easy to see, but they hadn't been quantified across the landscape. Certainly they'd been documented in a number of different studies, but nobody had tried to have a look at what was going on right across the Australian Alps landscape. And so that's what we went out to do. And obviously our particular interest was the treeless drainage lines, those streams and boggy bits up in the Alps. And that's because these places include state and Commonwealth listed threatened communities. They're different forms of the same thing, but and they go under various names. But these places are also really important habitat for a whole range of listed threatened species, either at state levels or at the Commonwealth level. And obviously they're fragile systems, vulnerable to impacts of climate change and other pressures. And they have high values in terms of water yield and in terms of contributions to catchment. So the Snowy River, for example, and the Murray and the Murrumbidgee all have their headwaters in the Australian Alps, and the Australian Alps contribute a lot to the average flow, the annual flow in the Murray-Darling Basin. This map over here just contextualises the Australian Alps, the grey area, in relation to the basin. Okay. All right, so this is getting down to a little bit of detail on what we did. All right, so we're looking at these treeless drainage lines, and we did it right across the Alps. So this map shows the distribution of our study sites from down here in Victoria, over in the Bargong High Plains area, right through the Eastern Alps of Victoria, through into southern Kosciuszko, and up right through into northern Kosciuszko and the edge of the ACT there. And our aim was to try and quantify how widespread and how severe horse impacts were across that landscape. So this is about our approach. And what we did is we took a comparative approach using sites where horses occur, where they live, and places where there are not horses. And we had 126 sites across the Alps that were occupied by horses and 57 that weren't. We used a GIS approach to randomly select these sites from across the Alps. And the sites were located in the Alpine National Park in Victoria, Kosciuszko National Park in New South Wales, Namadgi National Park in the ACT, as well as Bago and Maragli State Forests in New South Wales. Now, our approach was systematic and it was rapid, which meant we could cover lots and lots of sites, which was great. And it was based on an approach called ephemeral drainage line analysis developed by Tongwei and Ludwig. And this just looks at or assesses the condition of a drainage line by looking at things like its structure and the way it receives flows from the surrounding land, as well as the way water drains from the site. That little picture's a mocked up illustration using the wonders of technology to create a pretend place where across some imaginary line there's horses on the left-hand side and no horses on the right-hand side, just to give you a bit of a visualization of some of the differences you see in these sorts of places. Now, we looked at 9 different variables that can be broadly categorized into two areas. One of those areas dealt with sort of soil issues and stream bank stability issues, and the other considered vegetation cover. Our analyses compared the results from the sites with horses to results from sites without horses. And we did a couple of different sets of sub-analyses too. We extracted all the data for the sites that you'd classify as the listed sphagnum mossbed community, and did analyses just for those. And we extracted all the data for sites where there was any evidence of other herbivore species present, with deer, pigs, wombats, macropods, whatever that might be. And we left them out of the analysis just to see if results were similar with or without those other species present. Okay, so now we can start to have a look at some of the results. I should talk about the variables we looked at first. So here's a list of the variables we looked at, listed on the left-hand side of that table. The top 7 here were all sort of linked to, I suppose, soil, and the bottom ones here were to do with vegetation, and these are the attributes of those variables we considered. Now we can look at results. So they're pretty compelling. What we've got here is all the variables listed, and the bright red ticks indicate where we found significant differences between sites where horses occur and sites where horses don't occur. And you can see that for all the soil and stream bank variables, we detected significant differences. And in all instances, condition, if you like, was worse in horse-occupied sites. Okay, now this is what happened when we looked just at sites that you could consider to be the EPBC listed alpine or sphagnum mossbed community. And again, all those variables were significantly different. We also found a a weak effect for projected foliage cover differing between these as well. And finally, when we exclude data from any sites where other species were known, there was evidence of other species having been present, we still got these effects. And this is a really, really important result because in showing us that these effects that we were seeing were evident with or without the other species being present. So horses are very clearly having an impact across the Alps, and that's summarised here with horses absolutely affecting the condition of these treeless drainage lines. And that's a worry because they include these listed communities. These impacts were widespread. We found them right across the Alps and even in very remote and hard to access sites. And that means sites that were hard for horses to access as well as sites that were hard for people to access. So this is definitely a landscape scale issue, which is one of the things we were out to have a look at. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, there's another chapter to the story from a little bit of additional work that we commissioned. So back in 2017, we set up some work to go just to the Bogong High Plains. You might remember that from one of the earlier maps down in sort of the southeastern end of the Australian Alps. And in this piece of work, any of our sites that were assessed in our study were revisited, along with a number of bog or moss bed sites that had been assessed in a series of different studies at a similar time frame. And this is really scary because this piece of work, going back and having a look at what had changed, showed us that the horses had expanded in their range in the Bogong High Plains area, and the number of sites within that range that were affected by horse impacts had increased. It was very, very rare to find a place where its condition had improved. That was only, well, less than 4% of sites had improved. And, well, sites that didn't have any horse sign or evidence of horses being present remained stable, but the vast majority of sites where we had identified presence of horses in the past had gotten worse, And that would be a really, really, really horrible way for us to end this story. And you can certainly go and read those scary stories in these papers or reports if you want to. But happily, there is some hope. And what we know is that recovery is possible in these alpine systems. It might take a long time, and some damage might persist for a very long time, but recovery can occur. So the photo at the top is a recovering moss bed, a sphagnum bog in Kosciuszko National Park, 60 years on from massive degradation through things like domestic stock grazing. So it shows the regenerative potential of these sorts of systems if they're given a chance. And similarly, some small exclosure plots in the Cobberas in Victoria at Native Cat and Kawambat Flats show a similar story. And this is really interesting because you can actually, anyone who wants to, who's got access to Google Earth, can go and have a look at what's going on with this study. So I've just snipped a photo from Google Earth here, and this is a little bit of Kawambat Flat, which is right up near the Victoria-New South Wales border, right near where the Murray River starts. So really important in terms of, I suppose, national natural heritage. And you can see this treeless plain here, and you can see this drainage line along here, and you can see these four very different areas. They're areas where exclosure plots were set up, driven by a
sounds
energetic friends group.
We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you,
years ago,
John.
21 years ago. Oh,
I think you're back. Excellent. We can hear you again.
I did nothing except stop and start again.
Oh,
so have we got the story that we're up having a look at what Google Earth shows us up in the Cobberas?
Yeah, we heard that piece.
Beauty. And so here's the close-up, and you can see this drainage line, and outside these exclosures, it's absolutely pummeled. You can see all the pugging and the bank slumping and the channelization, and it's really nasty. But inside this plot over 20 years, you can see the sorts of recovery that's happened with the vegetation cover and with the stream bank. And so there's our story of hope. And it shows us that, you know, when you can take the pressure of horses off these sorts of places, you can get recovery. And that tells us that management is absolutely worthwhile. But the big challenge that remains for us, I suppose, is how to get that recovery potential realised across the Alps landscape. And I think that's what management programs now are trying to do. And that's where I suppose some of our future science will focus. That's really the whole story that I've got to tell. So I can stop there. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.